Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear audience, good morning, good day, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Welcome to the virtual book launch of the proceedings for what should have been the 12th International Conference on Cyber Conflict. My name is Liina Lumiste.
And my name is Henrik Beckvart. We will be your host for the next 3 days for this virtual book launch. And on behalf of the team at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, we're excited to have you with us online here from Tallinn.
But without further ado, we are very pleased to welcome on the stage Colonel Jaak Taren, the Director of NATO's CCD COE, to give his welcoming remarks. Please, Jaak, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liina. Thank you, Henrik. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed authors, dear faithful CyCon crowd, outside it is one of those 2 sunny days we get in Estonia every year. It's a perfect CyCon weather, but we're not having a CyCon. We really wanted to have the conference. We really were looking forward to discussions on a topic, 2020 vision, the next decade, and it's an irony and illuminating that the conference on this topic was taken out by an event that no one saw coming, the COVID-19 pandemic. I was a young staff officer in 2008 in Allied Command Transformation when they were presenting their Multiple Futures project. I remember there being valleys and peaks, and then there were swans. And the black swans swimming, hiding behind mountains and valleys, they were the events that nobody could see coming. Well, I'm sure that Multiple Futures project didn't see a couple months later Russia occupying Georgia in August 2008, and I'm sure it didn't see the COVID-19 pandemic. It just happens. So, but we're having a virtual book launch. You can see the book revolving behind Henrik and Liina there. Judging by the cover, it's the greatest CyCon book ever. Now, this is the reason we can't have a virtual conference, because when I try to be funny, I don't hear you boo. It's just an uncomfortable silence of an empty studio. We have 18 out of 19 authors. 18 brilliant minds have made magnificent work, very hard work. They deserve the academic credit. They deserve to be published. So we're publishing the book. You, the faithful CyCon crowd, you deserve to read it. So we're launching this book right now. We're going to have 3 short days. We're accommodating time zones between Europe and the United States. I know we have faithful audience in Asia as well. We couldn't make it comfortable for everybody, so have another cup of coffee in the middle of the night. Thanks for being with us. Today is strategy policy, tomorrow law, and last closing day on Thursday will be technology. On Thursday, also, when we close this book launch, we announce the next year's 2021 CyCon theme, and it's going to be a good one. I already know it. So, we have great authors. We have superb moderators. We have a really cool studio. So, what can go wrong? We have a superb team of CCD COE that put it all together. Stay with us, stay tuned. It's going to be a thrilling 3 short days of launching the CyCon 2020 Vision for the Next Decade book. So I'm going to hand it over to Henrik and Liina. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaak. Before we kick off, we just need to give a few practical pieces of information. The printed CyCon book, the 2020 Vision, the Next Decade, will be available through the CCD COE in the middle of June, and more information on that will be available on our webpage.
As mentioned, the book launch will run over 3 days with 2 sessions each day. Today, Tuesday, we have the Strategy Policy Day. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we will have 2 sessions dedicated to the legal articles. And finally, on Thursday, we will have 2 sessions on technology.
And each day, the first session begins at 1600 and the second around 1715 Eastern European time. We want to know what you think, so don't be shy to express your opinions. You may find the relevant hashtags on our webpage.
All the practical information regarding this event can be found on our webpage. All the sessions will last roughly an hour, following 10 to 15 minutes break where you can stretch your legs or have a nice cup of coffee, and we can set up the next session.
So with the practical remarks out of the way, it's time for our first session, and I would like to give the floor to the first moderator, Dr. Max Schmitz, from the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. Please, Max, the floor is yours. I don't think we can hear you, Max.
A warm welcome.
We can hear you now. Thank you.
The first virtual session of CyCon 2020. I'm really pleased to be moderating this session, not only because we have a star lineup of speakers, but also because these 3 papers discussed in this session provide really interesting insights, which in some ways are overlapping, but also potentially at odds. So it promises to be really interesting. Before we start, let me briefly discuss a few online house rules. The speakers will talk for no more than 15 minutes. You're free to submit written questions during the talk, and we will collect them and give the speakers a few minutes after each talk to address the questions. If we have more time at the very end of the session, we welcome more general questions and potentially directed at multiple speakers. Right, without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, Professor Martin Libicki. Professor Libicki holds the Kaiser Chair of Cybersecurity Studies at the US Naval Academy. Prior employment includes 12 years at the National Defense University, 3 years at the Navy staff, and 3 years at the US Government Accountability Office. His research has been published widely, as many of you know. In fact, I didn't do a formal count, but he may very well be the most published author on cyber strategy and information technology in the world. Martin, the virtual stage is yours.
Okay, thank you for that kind introduction. Happy to be here. I'd be even happier if I were really there, but circumstances have put me behind the laptop rather than in person. Now, okay, we have the first text here. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, I don't know how legible that's going to be. Is that particularly legible? Should I read the stuff? Okay, that's much better. I put it up there mostly because I want to discuss the subtext rather than the text. The text you can read. The subtext is really the question about what is escalation? How does cyber attack, cyber war, cyberspace operations play into the whole tableau of escalation? And the first question you have to ask when you put cyber into an escalation matrix is, the first question you have to ask when you put cyber into an escalation matrix is the cyber box somehow one of those things that's going to get you into the kinetic box? In other words, you have sort of 2 propositions. The first proposition is that cyberspace is its own domain in the sense that whatever happens in cyberspace stays in cyberspace. The world of kinetic conflict is its domain, and there's unlikely to be crossing from one to the other. The second proposition, the opposite one, is in fact that cyberspace merely occupies a position on the spectrum of conflict, that there is no ipso facto reason why events that start in cyberspace cannot end up in kinetic space, and that, as some people have said, conflict in cyberspace is particularly escalatory for a large number of reasons. So what I wanted to do with this paper is to try to tease out some of the paths in which there may be correlations between events in cyberspace and events in the kinetic world. Okay, so the first question, let's go to the next slide, is do countries retaliate in the real world for operations in cyberspace? Okay, well, let's start off with the simpler questions. In fact, is there retaliation in cyberspace in and of itself? Well, there are certain things that you see. You see tit-for-tat dyads in cyberspace, for instance, between India-Pakistan dyad, in the one between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and the broader Arab world, between Israel and Iran. But generally speaking, one is more struck by the lack of retaliation in cyberspace than actual retaliation in cyberspace. Okay, now there are a few instances. There is the opinion that the 2012 DDoS attacks that Iran pulled on US banks were a retaliation for Stuxnet. There is some sort of evidence that the Saudi Aramco wiper attacks in 2012 were a retaliation for wiper attacks on Iranian refineries, whose attribution still remains murky, I believe. And to accommodate my talk, last week or so, there was a retaliation by Israel, presumably Israel, against Iranian ports in retaliation for an attack that was blamed on the Iranians on Israeli waterworks. Okay? But again, those are really positive examples. Now, when you go to the question at hand, which is physical retaliation for cyber attacks, there is almost no evidence. The only possible piece of evidence, and I want to underline possible and disputed, is the assassination of Motaba, and I'm not going to get this one pronounced correctly, Ahmadi, for a cyber attack carried out on part of Israel's infrastructure in the city of Haifa. Okay, so at this point, let's go to the next slide. Okay, second question is there a basis for retaliation? In other words, have people made the equivalence between cyber attacks and physical attacks? And one of the characteristics of a cyber attack is we have yet to, after 25 years of staring at this particular space, seen a cyber attack which has produced casualties as a direct result. Now, there are some disputed issues about casualties as an indirect result of a cyber attack. There's investigations, for instance, that the wannabe attacks that affected some US hospitals may have led to an increased mortality rate. There's been investigation in Britain which suggested that there might be, except the conclusion was, in fact, that they couldn't find any increased mortality rate. But direct casualties, we haven't seen. Okay? So the question is, do you want to go from a realm in which there are no direct casualties into a realm, in fact, where direct casualties are what the activity is about? And for this, the question then becomes, are we starting to see an emerging threshold that separates damaging but non-lethal operations from lethal operations? That's actually a broader topic here. Let me just suggest that we may be seeing the beginnings of that sort of threshold. Not as strong as the threshold between war and peace, or as strong, we believe, as the threshold between conventional and nuclear war, but an emerging threshold nonetheless. If you switch to academic research, people like Jacqueline Snyder and others have basically used polling and test data to indicate a general reluctance of people in war games or people who are polled to see the two as equivalent. Okay? Precisely because, in my opinion, of the casualty difference. Okay? Other work by Jensen Valeriano suggests, looking at data sets, suggests that cyber attacks are more likely to provide not an escalation, but as a means, as an off-ramp to a crisis, a way of saying, I'm not happy with what you're doing, but I definitely don't want a war out to result from this anyhow. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, this is an interesting question because we end up having to dispute the premise. Does cyberspace escalation lead to kinetic escalation? And that leads to the question, is there such a thing as cyberspace escalation? Okay? And the answer may not necessarily be yes. And the reason the answer may not necessarily be yes is several factors. First of all, escalation implies continuous operations, sort of a level of one, you start at a level of one activity and you go to a level of a next activity, okay? If you actually take a look at cyberspace operations, they tend to be episodic, not continuous, and it tends to be very difficult to establish that there is a specific level of combat going on in cyberspace. Now, that is true so far. That may not be true in a future scenario, but so far that seems to be the case, okay? Next question, changes in intensity. There is a RAND report put out about a dozen years ago, which had a nice definition of escalation, and it was two parts. One is a change in intensity, the other is a crossing of thresholds. Okay, both of them are problematic in cyberspace. A change in intensity would be the change in effort. For instance, it was widely understood that we were the United States was escalating the conflict in Vietnam by putting more forces into the country. Okay? Well, more forces doesn't necessarily translate into very much in cyberspace. And anyway, you can't see more forces being drawn into a conflict in cyberspace because of the nature of the beast. And the correlation between the amount of effort you put in cyberspace and the amount of effects you get is hardly straightforward. There is a great deal of noise in the equation between efforts on one hand and effects on the other. That leaves us the second criterion, which is the change in thresholds. Okay, for a change in thresholds, you need a consensus that certain things are below a threshold and certain things are above a threshold. We are nowhere near that consensus in cyberspace. The closest we have to a threshold is to distinguish attacks on infrastructure from all other cyber attacks. But if you look at that definition closely, it's extremely gauzy. So the question remains hypothetical. In other words, we don't have escalation in cyberspace that we can talk about, and therefore asking whether it's caused kinetic escalation is in many ways a question too far. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Would cyberspace operations on sensitive targets put them in play? Again, this is a hypothetical. And so basically the paper talked it through hypothetical. In other words, if there are targets where we don't want them touched for military reasons, but if you carry out a cyber attack on them, is it possible that it will remove the inhibition for a physical attack on these systems? Okay, the two systems I have in mind are satellites and nuclear command and control systems. And I'm going to basically have to draw a blank on that question because we have seen cyber attacks on satellites. We have seen testing of anti-satellite weapons. The two don't tend to be correlated yet. As far as nuclear command and control issues, there are known public cyber attacks on nuclear command and control. So we don't really have all that much to work with. Okay, and let's go to the next question. And next slide, excuse me. And the next slide, I'm going to actually ask this in a very strange question. In other words, will countries draw inferences from one side's failure to respond to a cyber attack in such a way that emboldens them to carry out a kinetic attack? And I have one example in mind, and that is the proposition, the hypothesis that a failure to react to the Saudi Aramco case in 2012 may have emboldened, I don't like the word, but I can't think of a synonym right now, may have emboldened Iran to carry out kinetic attacks on Saudi Aramco physical facilities in 2019. Okay, but if you're going to take a look at Iran's attack on the facilities, probably a better case would be the events that had taken place several months earlier in the Persian Gulf, in which a U.S. Global Hawk was shot down, and there was not a kinetic response to that. Perhaps because nobody was killed in the Global Hawk attack, since it was an unmanned aircraft. So I would have to answer the question that there may be at some future point that sort of correlation, but we haven't seen it yet. Okay, let's get to the conclusions and on the next slide. Okay, conclusions. So far, the evidence suggests that what starts in cyberspace stays in cyberspace. But I have to offer these caveats. One, this is true so far. Cyber attacks could get worse, and if they get worse, they may approach the point where some countries cross over from cyber into kinetic space. Number two, this is based on public reports. Okay, if things have happened in the classified world, I don't have access to them, and I wouldn't be able to talk about it if I did. And number three, some of you in the audience may have noticed that a lot of evidence was pulled from what has taken place vis-a-vis Iran. Notably, the competition between Iran and Israel, but also the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the competition between Iran and the United States. So those are my conclusions, heavily caveated, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present to the virtual CyCon. Thank you.
Martin, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. We may never know, but I think at least many viewers are currently giving you a standing ovation. Let me ask you one question. I don't see the audience questions yet on my screen, so I'm giving you one of my own. And that's the following. One of the propositions that is currently missing from your analysis is whether cyber operations can also lead to a further escalation, so that further intensification during an armed conflict. Of course, we may not know now, given the limited cases that we could potentially consider, if at all. But what are your views on this?
My views on this is that cyber escalation is a much richer topic when you're outside of armed conflict than when you're inside of armed conflict. In other words, I take it as a proposition that if there's a class of targets for which a lethal attack is appropriate under the laws of armed conflict, or at least is going on, that any cyber attack is going to be within the realm of permitted. In other words, if I can take out a surface-to-air missile by using, if I can take out a surface-to-air missile using a kinetic attack, I can certainly take out one using a cyber attack, and there is no limit to the cyber attack that can be carried out. That having been said, one of the risks, again, potential, because we don't have a great deal of evidence on this, that occurs when you use cyber attacks in the context of a kinetic war is it slips outside the bounds of the war. In other words, it's a conventional conflict, but you have managed to interfere with nuclear systems. There's a gentleman by the name of Acton, who's at Carnegie Corporation, who's discussed sort of what he considers entanglement. Okay, so it's inadvertent escalation to the I've just touched a nuclear system level. Another potential escalation, which is very possible in cyberspace because systems don't necessarily have the same geography as in the physical world, is that if it's a localized conflict, some of your effects may be non-local. And there is also the possibility that an attack on a military system may end up being an attack on a civilian system. But at this point, everything's theoretical.
Thank you. I think there's much more to discuss here, but in the interest of time, let us move on. Next up is Matthias Schulze, one of the leading cybersecurity thinkers in Germany. Matthias is a researcher at the Security Division of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, where he is also the coordinator of the Cyber Research Cluster. His research focuses on what can be called the dark side of digitization, namely the strategic use of offensive cyber operations in international security, which is also the topic of his talk today. Please welcome to the virtual stage, Matthias Schulze.
Hi there, wherever you are. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research to you at this virtual venue that we have here. So this paper is part of a study that I'm currently doing at SWP about the utility of military cyber operations. And the backdrop is basically, so cyber warfare has been hyped as this new all-purpose sword. For example, according to Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, or there's a lovely book by David Sanger out called The Perfect Weapon, and where he basically makes this argument that cyber warfare is the best thing out there, to paraphrase here. And many military strategies from around the world herald offensive cyber capabilities as the next best thing as well. Meanwhile, the academic literature is a little bit more skeptical. There's lots of debate about the limitations of cyber in general. Remember the cyber deterrence debate, where the rough consensus seems to be, well, it's not really working that well, but we don't know really why it's not really working, and maybe it's working at some levels, but not at others, and we can't really explain this. Then there's this debate about cyber coercion. There's a good paper from Erica Borchardt and Sean Lonergan where they basically argue that it's really hard to coerce or compel an adversary to your will using alone. And then there's a book by Brendan Varajano et al. On cyber strategy who highlight the limitations of cyber as a tool for foreign policy in general, claiming that the primary value of this tool is not in necessarily destructive effects, but rather in tacit bargaining. So the messaging function is more important than the actual destructive effects. And then there are people like Joshua Rovner, for example, basically arguing that cyber conflicts have more in common with intelligence contests. And if this is true, cyber conflicts operate under other conditions than traditional military conflicts. And this left me basically wondering, so what good is cyber under these conditions? Or rather, what is the military utility of offensive cyber capabilities? And more importantly, what are some of the limitations of offensive cyber capabilities? And under what conditions do they work and under which don't they work? Because if we overestimate or underestimate the utility of this tool, we might use it wrong. In Germany, a couple of years ago, we had the lovely debate about our German assault rifle, the G36, which overheated in the desert context of Afghanistan. So the weapon itself was fine, but we used it under wrong conditions because it was designed for Middle European temperatures and not for desert or heat scenarios in Afghanistan. So we were basically using it wrong, to paraphrase Steve Jobs here. So what are my central arguments? So I looked at some cases where offensive cyber capabilities have been used in armed conflict. And here's a caveat, of course, I only looked at military cyber operations, although they are sometimes really hard to differentiate from intelligence operations, so it's not necessarily clear-cut. I ignored most of the cybercrime, which also could be state-sponsored, but who knows, so I left this out. And this, left me with a rather short list of incidents. And in order to organize this study, I used the 3 levels of warfare heuristic, which basically divides military actions on 3 levels: the strategic, the operational, and the tactical level. And most research out there so far has been done on the strategic level. Strategic operations are those that try to influence the cost-benefit calculus of an adversary without necessarily engaging or using conventional forces. So in terms of cases, there's not really a case where this happens, so we have to revert to a hypothetical scenario, which is Nitro's use, an operation described by David Sanger in his book that I just mentioned, the fallback plan by US Cyber Command against Iran in case the Stuxnet operation or Olympic Games failed. So the idea was basically shutting down an entire country for a longer period of time. And what they found, or what Sanger describes by referring to insiders, is that it turns out that it's really complicated to do because you need access to lots of critical infrastructure. And this is difficult to do because you don't need just one backdoor implant in critical infrastructure, but potentially if you want to shut down an entire country, you need probably hundreds, or I don't know, a couple of hundreds to create damaging effects. And you have to keep track of them. So you have to know how these backdoor implants interact with each other and in what sequence you engage, basically. And you need a lot of people to organize this. And many countries simply don't have that many operators that can launch attacks at this scale and level. And in terms of war, there's the general problem that was outlined by Martin Libicki a couple of years ago in one of his books, and where he basically argues that cyber cannot really permanently disarm an opponent, and it's really difficult to occupy a territory with cyber alone, which is still quite important to win a war, nevertheless. Likewise, you cannot win a war with just the air force alone, as we have learned in Libya, for example, or in Syria, or in many other conflicts. And then there is this other issue that in many conflicts, your primary adversaries are those AK-47 wielding low-tech guerrilla or insurgent forces, which you cannot really disable with cyber attacks. So in conflicts where this is the condition, you probably can't use it, or the tool is not as useful. So what about the operational level? And this is using cyber in context of a conventional military war or conflict together with conventional force. And the overall assessment here is a little bit better. So you can chain cyber plus conventional together, either sequentially, so shutting down the radar with a cyber attack and then coming in with the air force, or you do it in parallel, as the Russians, for example, did in Georgia or in Ukraine. And the challenge is, and this is true for all military branches and not unique to cyber anyway, it's to create jointness. It's really hard to synchronize effects, especially if you use proxy actors like patriotic hackers. There are a lot of countries out there that use proxy hackers or organized crime groups, and it's really difficult to organize these into, military chain of command style coordination of attacks. So if you have the military behind you, it's probably easier to synchronize your troops. And singular attacks seem easier to pull off than continuous campaigns, because there's a lot of man or woman power involved in that, and it's really difficult to keep track of what you're doing. I also found is that cyber first strikes at the beginning of a conflict, for example, to generate surprise effects, seem worthwhile. That is, if you have enough preparation time. And this is an important lesson if you study cases of non-use where the capability has not been used. Because if you don't have access, if you don't have enough preparation time, you probably can't use this tool. And then there's some indication that, decapitation strategies might be working, and that is slowing down military communications or networks, introducing friction, and this might be a worthwhile effect. One of the general problems is the malware development cycle, because you have to synchronize your malware development cycle with your burn rate. So this is nothing new in military conflict as well. If you burn more of your artillery shells, for example, than you can reproduce, then you're running out of ammunition. So you can make the analogy probably in the cyber domain as well, that if you burn more malware or if more of your vulnerabilities gets patched and you cannot reproduce them quickly enough, then you lose your momentum. So preparation time is an important variable we need to look at. If you don't have time, if you don't have intelligence access, if you have not prepared the battlefield, then cyber attacks probably won't work that well. So what about the last level, the tactical level? And there has not been much written about this. And this is the use of cyber capabilities in the field on the level of individual combat engagements. So the idea here basically is that, for example, you pair special forces together with IT guys, allowing them to shut down an adversary tech equipment like microdrones, for example, or digital personal assistants of the soldier of the future directly in the field in front of you. And if you study instances where this was experimented with, you find general issues of deconflictions or questions of who has the authority to launch anything. Is it the troops on the ground or the battalion level, or is it the strategic command level, or even the intelligence agencies in countries where cyber capabilities are housed at intelligence agencies? The problem is that, and Martin Libicki described this already, you have an inherent risk that cyber attacks cascade out of control and create strategic effects, maybe for example, globally. If you look at the NotPetya incident, which basically spiraled out of control, you have to worry about that, a tactical operation to, shut down a video camera in a building to do a hostage raid maybe escalates because you did not anticipate the effects well enough. And this is the reason why in many countries, decisions to launch cyber attacks are made at the strategic level. And this is at odds with, the requirements of troops in the fields and the tactical level. Lastly, if you look at lessons learned from Afghanistan or from Iraq, for example, there's this lesson that technology fails in difficult environments. In deserts, for example, you need radio access, you need batteries and stuff like that. And if there's a meaningful electronic warfare capability, you might not be able to use this stuff at all. So this is also a restraint or a limiter for the usefulness of this tool in these contexts. So to sum up, the metaphor of the perfect weapon does not hold completely. Cyber in war works, but only if certain conditions are met. And the realistic finding is that cyber operations are probably most well suited for espionage and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance functions, but not necessarily that great for achieving destructive effects. Of course, and this is a similar caveat that was uttered before, this might change in the future as, for example, training gets better, as synchronization gets better, and as more adversaries use digital equipment on the field. So that is it from my side. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Matthias. Let me ask you one brief question, and hopefully we can get back to your talk after the last talk as well. The two key variables, as you mentioned, that drive your hypothesis on the utility of cyber operations is one, timing, and two, operational complexity. Could you tell us a little bit more about this operational complexity in particular? And what I'm looking for is, how much is this really self-imposed by the actor conducting these operations, and how much is this target related?
Thanks. Yeah, so timing, I talked about this a little bit. It seems easier to launch first strikes in conflict, so this is a timing variable. The other is complexity, and this is you can translate this into how difficult it is to achieve your effects. And if you want, you can divide this up further into further variables. For example, how organized are your troops? Right, the degree of organization and the management strategies and so forth, they impact how efficient you are and how well you can maneuver and how quick you are. There's this lovely episode of the US Operation Glowing Symphony against ISIS, which describes nicely that Cyber Command had to overcome many bureaucratic hurdles in order to launch this operation. And this organizational variable basically affected the operational effectivity of the counter-ISIS operation. But it's also not stuff that depends on your organization, but it also depends on the target variables as well. So for example, how hard to hit something is. If there's an air-gapped system, you need to spend more effort. If the system is well protected, you probably need zero-day vulnerability to get in, and you need to establish them first. You need to do some reconnaissance. If you think about the Stuxnet operation, you probably need to have human intelligence operators in place to drop USB drives or thumbsticks and so forth. So all this plays into operational complexity. And this is true for all military operations in general. The higher the complexity, the more uncertainty you have in the end.
Thank you. Last but not least, we have a talk presenting the results of a year-long research project conducted by the Center for Geopolitics of the Data Sphere, abbreviated GEOD. It's a multidisciplinary team made up of geographers, computer scientists, and area specialists. With us today, we have Professor Frédérique Duzet, Professor of Geopolitics at the University of Paris and Director of GEOD. She will be joined by Louis Pétignot, one of the brilliant PhD students working under her wing. He's not only a great regional expert on the Black Sea, but he's also very handy when it comes to using methods for mapping and visualizing data. Frédérique and Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like first to thank you for giving us the opportunity to present our research and managing to publish the book on time for this session. So this is really the result of interdisciplinary work, and I would like to acknowledge our other authors, Lokman Salamatian, Kevin Limonier, Kaveh Salamatian, and Thibaut Alkes. We developed in our team a methodology to map the lower layers of cyberspace and basically to find out the routes that the data can travel. And our main hypothesis, because we used the border gateway protocol data, the main hypothesis of our work was that this BGP could be manipulated for geopolitical reasons in the context of a large crisis, and that this manipulation could lead to further fragmentation of cyberspace. So we decided to focus on the Ukrainian crisis and see whether we could observe, but also represent this fragmentation. And since Louis is such a bright PhD student, I will give him the privilege to present our research.
Well, thank you, Frédérique, and thank you everyone for being here. So yes, our article is about the measurement of fragmentation of the internet in Ukraine during the crisis, which started in 2014. So to understand how we use the border gateway protocol to do that, we have first to go back to how the internet works. So can we have the next slide, please? So the internet is itself the result of the interconnection of tens of thousands of independent autonomous systems, which are networks. So for instance, internet packets from this video stream, they go through multiple ASs from one AS, which is my internet service provider or ISP, to another one, which is yours, going through all the way through multiple other ASs. Because autonomous systems, they vary in size and role, we have three main categories, which are tier mostly backbone carriers, tier 2 medium-sized internet service providers, and tier 3, which we call subdomains, which are ASs at the end of the network. Next slide, please. So why do we study those autonomous systems with a geopolitical prism? Well, it's because they interconnect with this protocol called Border Gateway Protocol, BGP, which can be described as a political tool because AES operators choose to connect to certain autonomous systems and not others. And when they do that, they also implement routing algorithms or routing policies, which are set up to decide what to do with the data they receive and which they have to forward in the network. And these choices involve commercial, security, and political considerations. And BGP is also geopolitical because autonomous systems are inscribed in space. And for instance, when they provide internet access to specific territories, autonomous systems can be strategic tools. So we have a geopolitical context here, which is a major crisis in Ukraine since 2014, which resulted in territorial conflicts in Crimea and the Donbass. And our question was, what was the role of the network of autonomous systems in the strategies of control over those territories? Next slide, please. And we have a whole system of data collection set up by two of our authors, which I will not describe in detail because it's rather technical, but it gathers AES relationships around the world. And well, there are limitations to this data collection. For instance, because public BGP data cannot be fully exhaustive, but and also because BGP relationships can change sometimes at a very fast pace. Next slide, please. But what we can do with this data is look at how the internet is structured. Here we have a graph, which is a representation of a network. And this is a network of Ukrainian autonomous systems and their direct neighbors in 2019. And here we have nodes, which are autonomous systems, linked between them being AES relationships, and the size depends on their importance in the network of Ukraine. And we can observe several things here. First, that the Ukrainian network is a resilient one. We have numerous autonomous systems with multiple paths that connect to the rest of the internet. The second thing we can say is that it's a bipolar network because Ukrainians access the global internet mainly through Russia or Western path. And the last thing we see, and that we will study in detail later, is that Donbass and Crimea here are distinct networks from Ukraine. Next slide, please. And if we look at the simplified version of Ukraine's networks, we can see much better this bipolarity because we have a clear pole of Russian autonomous systems in red and a Western pole with United States AESs in purple or European in yellow. Next slide, please. Okay, and we have the next, thank you. And if we look also at the distribution of Ukrainian autonomous systems neighbors by country of registration, we can see that Russia plays a big part in the network of Ukraine. However, US autonomous systems or Western as a whole autonomous systems are increasing in the neighborhood of Ukraine. Next slide, please. So why do we look at Donbass and Crimea? Because in 2013, Donbass and Crimea are fully embedded in the Ukrainian internet. As we can see on the left here, where we have Ukrainian autonomous systems in blue and Russian in red, we can see, for instance, that two major providers, Crimeacom and Qualcomm, are fully integrated into Ukraine. However, in 2019, on the right, we can see that the separation is very clear. And furthermore, most Crimean autonomous systems are now registered in Russia. And we want to understand how this incorporation took place. Next slide, please. So here we can see the distribution over time of Crimea's autonomous systems by country of registration. And we can see that autonomous systems based and operating in Crimea are more and more registered in Russia. And the incorporation of Crimea into the federation as a whole was a long and complex process that started in March 2014 and which involved, for instance, infrastructures, energy supply, etc. But we also witnessed the Russian strategy of digital annexation with various elements such as laying cables between Crimea and Russia in 2014 and 2017, setting up a local branch of Rostelecom, which is the biggest Russian transit provider, and buying industrial cables, equipment, and even local ISPs companies in Crimea. And on the other hand, there were sanctions issued by the Ukrainian government against ISPs in Ukraine working in Crimea. So Ukrainian ISPs were also withdrawing from the peninsula. Next slide, please. And the result of this strategy can be seen here because we have here the network of Crimea in 2019 and their neighbors. And we can see that Crimea's network is now structured around three major providers, Crimeacom, Miranda, and Qualcomm in green, and that Crimea's path to the rest of the internet mostly depend on major Russian ASs that you can see at the center of the network, Rostelecom, SPBNIT, and Fjord in red. Next slide, please. So the situation of the level of autonomous systems in Crimea has consequences, and we can see those consequences in the shape of cyberspace, which are visible in other ways and with other data. So if we take a look at those two maps, they were done with latency data. And latency is basically a measure of the speed it takes for data packets to reach a point on the internet and to go back to its source. So what we did here was take RIPE Atlas probes, which are little devices connected to the internet in Ukraine and Russia, and we targeted two specific locations, namely Simferopol, the capital city of Crimea, and Novakhovka, which is a city just above Crimea's border in Ukrainian-controlled land. And the results that we can see here show how topology reflects geopolitics, because on the left, when the target is Simferopol, we can see that data goes much faster from Moscow towards Simferopol than even from the rest of Ukraine, which is much closer in space. And on the other hand, for Novakhovka, we can see that data is going much faster from Kiev than from other parts of Russia. Next slide, please. The last thing we did was a longitudinal study of autonomous systems in Ukraine and Russia. So here we have four different dates of the situation from 2014 to 2018. And we can observe three tendencies between Russian and Ukrainian networks. The first one being the breakup and integration of Crimea into the Russian networks. The second one being the marginalization of Donbass, which is more and more becoming separate networks on its own, and which echoes its geopolitical situation. And the last thing we see is a gradual increase in the distance between the two countries because they are less and less connected to each other. Next slide, please. So, as conclusions, we have been able to show with this paper that geopolitical conflicts over territories do have a clear impact on the shape of cyberspace. And in this case, the evolution of connectivity in Crimea and Donbass show first that there are digital front lines and how they can be important features of modern territorial conflicts. And the other thing that we saw was that the evolution of connectivity is actually a process involving multiple stakeholders. So, for instance, it would be quite easy to see the Crimean integration as a grand scheme decided in Moscow, but it really is a result of actions from both the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, private companies, and of course, local authorities in Crimea. So it's probably an invitation to be careful when thinking about how internet is structured. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry. Let me start off with a short question, and that is about the generalizability of your case. Have we seen actually any other countries showing these deliberate strategies of what might be called territorial appropriation in cyberspace as well?
So I may answer this question. What we're doing is we've developed this methodology and we're starting to apply it to different territories to see what happens. We actually did a study previously to this one on Iran, and we actually had a paper ready that demonstrated how Iran reorganized the structure of its connectivity in order to be able to disconnect it from the global internet. And they actually did it right after in November. So we can infer strategies that can either be appropriation of a territory, or at least attempting at exerting sovereign control over what these countries perceive as being their share of cyberspace. What is clear is that the attempts by Russia to disconnect its internet from the global internet, and I think the last one was in December, is clearly intended at trying to achieve what Iran has been able to do. And One thing we didn't present that's in our paper is a measure of complexity of the network that shows how diverse and rich the network is and the multiple connections it might have. So Russia is far from being able to do this now, but it's clearly a strategic goal that was put into law. So we're seeing more and more countries interested in this strategic dimension of BGP.
Thank you. Before I ask the next question, let me address the audience. In case you have any questions for any of the three panelists now, we still have 10 minutes to discuss these three interesting papers. So feel free to submit anything through the chat, and I will select these questions and address them to our panelists. Frédéric and Thierry, one more question that directly relates to the two other papers. To what degree is this work a strong critique, actually, against existing cyber conflict literature, particularly those which you find in international relations and international security? What I'm thinking about, are they not looking, and maybe myself including, at the wrong thing? Is it not about this potential tit-for-tat dynamics of cyber effect operations that may or may not occur during conflict, but instead about these more subtle types of activities that may shape cyberspace, these activities that still can have significant effect, but may not necessarily be visible, especially not to those who are doing the type of groundbreaking research that you are doing?
So let me give a short answer so Louis can answer as well. I think you need to look at everything, but definitely some countries have a longer term vision and strategic goals that they achieve through less visible operations. And to be completely fair, we would never have considered studying the strategic dimension of cyber operations if we had not had computer scientists like Kaveh Salamatian pointing to us that this was a very strategic subject. So definitely this dimension is understudied in the strategic literature, and the great difficulty is to reconcile the very technical approaches with the strategic approaches, and to be able to collect data very often with tools that are absolutely not designed to do geopolitics in order to be able to not only understand what's going on, but represent it in a way that's understandable for non-technical people.
Mm-hmm. Matthias and Martin, to bring you into the conversation, I was wondering for both of you on a question related to the dyadic nature of cyber operations utility, as well as the potential for escalation. We may look at this often from a kind of tit-for-tat perspective, but when we think about escalation, think about stability, think about the utility of cyber operations, we may want to take a more holistic approach and see how also other actors are reacting to an ongoing conflict between two other actors going in this space. What's your view on this, and how should we consider this in relation to your papers?
Sometimes
Martin,
I think it's hard enough. Oh, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's hard enough to get evidence on dyadic interactions, much less try to find out what third parties are doing. There have been a number of false flags attacks in the world of cyber. Most of them seem to be by one outfit, the GRU. If people are carrying on espionage to try to figure out what's going on in a particular conflict, oftentimes that will remain fairly hidden. So this might be an iceberg effect, that there are third-party effects, but they're mostly invisible. Or alternatively, if you're not seeing them, it's because they're not there to be seen.
But Martin, would you not see maybe WannaCry and NotPetya as one of those type of third-party effects?
Well,
that is very visible.
WannaCry would characterize as pure ransomware that was not very competently done. NotPetya is a really strange creature, and as I think you pointed out, it had unintended effects, not because of the squirreliness of cyberspace, but if I had to make a guess, it's because I think the people who put together the malware didn't realize that non-Ukrainian firms also pay Ukrainian income tax. And the result was that a lot of folks who have global operations, particularly logistics operations, found themselves with malware-laden Ukrainian tax software, which in turn infected everybody else. So this may be a case, and I have no special insight into this, where what started out to be a dyad ended up having a lot of third-party effects because of the nature of the attack.
Let me turn to Frédérique, as I believe she wants to, she has what we normally say, a two-finger and a direct comment, and then I'll turn to Matthias.
Yeah, I just wanted to point that that's definitely a common feature between the three papers, the idea that it can have an intended effect and massive consequences, and definitely the manipulation of BGP have massive effects, and we've seen that in the past with Pakistan trying to manipulate BGP and turning off YouTube for a large part of the world. So the impact on the stability and security of cyberspace is huge. And the other thing I wanted to point, because it's, I mean, we didn't insist on it, is what happens with the structure of connectivity. It's not the BGP, agreements between ASs are not, autonomous systems are often not public and are very hard to guess. So the idea of our paper is that we use the PGP data in order to infer what is actually going on and make what's invisible visible.
Thank you. Matthias?
Right. To come back at your questions about the more holistic view of things, I totally agree with that. But there are some methodological issues that make this really difficult to research. One is the delay of the interactions, or the tit for tat, so to speak. And this is a matter of the attribution problem, so to speak. So how long does it take to attribute with a certain degree of certainty, so to speak? So it's not really tit for tat, but it's rather tit and then wait. Okay, now we are certain it was them, and then tat, and then the cycle begins anew from the other perspective. So the temporal dynamics of this tit for tat stuff are really difficult, and I'm not really sure how much visibility the state actors or the dyads have in this context.
Thank you. Let me turn to a couple of interesting questions that came in from the audience. The first one is about the potential ways in which Crimea can respond to the activity that you uncovered by the research team in Paris. What kind of countermeasure does Crimea or any geographical area facing this type of modification of its internet routing have?
To take this one, it's really hard to answer this question because in the current situation, Crimea has apparently no wish to develop countermeasures in any way. And maybe Ukraine would like to gain more control over the internet of Crimea, but for the time being, they have no possible way to intervene in this no-closed, well, beyond this no-closed borders with Crimea.
And to add a second question to that, you've now talked about one element of PGP hacking, if I'm correct, and that's diverting local internet traffic. But have you looked at other forms of as well, or not?
Other forms? What do you mean?
Well, for instance, if you can divert local traffic, there might be also potential ways of actually inserting it with bogus traffic, right? Have you looked at those forms?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the one of the things we noticed about Iran is that so there were only 3 points of connection between the domestic network and the global internet. But inside the network in Iran, we could see that the network was very rich and diverse. So it means that there were many routes for data that the data could take. So the network itself is very resilient. And this can help also hide cyber operations within the network because they might be much more difficult to track back. And I'm also, if I can react to the question I'm seeing about how NATO should design a approach to counter Russia, Iran, or Chinese activity concerning technical internet infrastructure. It's interesting to reverse the question and ask ourselves how much of these activities are also due to what these countries perceive as a threat to their sovereignty and the reason why they put this type of activities in place.
I believe our time is up. Thank you all for tuning in. Whilst they probably won't hear you, please feel free to join me in applauding for our speakers. Mind your desk, and I hope to see you all at the next session. Thank you.
Thank you to the moderator, Dr. Max Smeets, and of course our distinguished panelists for a very interesting first session. We have received a little notice that few of our viewers may have had some issues with the stream. Apologize for that. They should now be fixed, and hopefully the next sessions will run without any problems.
Right. As mentioned, we'll now have a quick coffee break, so you can have a coffee, stretch your legs, and we can reset for the next panel.
And please be here back 17:15 Eastern European Time for the next and final session for the Strategy Policy Day.